the lost boy. "Ready or not, here I come!" Julie called out loudly, standing by an old broad oak tree just outside the village. She turned quickly, her face lighting up with joy. Her eyes sparkled, and she smiled so wide that her little baby teeth peeked out. She was standing in front of a small but dense forest that sloped gently uphill, where rounded rocks and a few stumps left by woodcutters dotted the ground here and there. It was the perfect spot for a game of hide and seek, and kids from all over the village loved playing here. When she noticed a little brown linen cap peeking out from behind a nearby stump, she immediately shouted, "I see Adrian!" "What? How can you see me?" shouted little Adrian angrily, still awkwardly crouched behind the stump. "I see your cap, you goof," said Julie calmly, and she began to walk slowly toward him, glancing around as she went to spot where the others might be hiding. Adrian sighed, stood up, and muttered to himself, "That's strange. I thought she'd find Thomas first." Then he shrugged and headed straight for the old oak tree. "So, who's going to be next?" Julie teased loudly, looking around to see if anyone might try to beat her to the tree. But there was no one in sight. She smiled a little, knowing she was the fastest among the kids. When it was her turn, she always managed to find or catch everyone before they could make it to the old oak, the home base. Thomas, the youngest of all the kids and almost always the first to be found, had hidden behind a large rock this time. And as soon as he heard that Julie had found Adrian first, he decided he'd try to go even deeper into the forest. He didn't actually want to win. He knew he had no chance against Julie, but he wanted to enjoy being hidden just a little longer. Usually by this point, he would already be standing by the old oak, waiting for the others to join him. So he began inching backward, away from the rock, crouching down as low as he could. When he bumped into a tree, he carefully moved around it and kept going, hiding behind one tree, then a bush, then another rock. "Got you, Veronica," he heard Julie say, not even noticing how her usually sharp voice sounded slightly weaker. Thomas kept going further and further until suddenly he lost his footing completely. He slid down the steep hill, feet first, on his belly as if on a slide, and finally landed with a bump on his seat at the bottom. The boy was initially in shock because he hadn't expected that at all, so he sat there motionless for a moment. Then he began looking around, first to his left, then to his right, and finally he looked up to see where he had slid down from. "Mom!" Thomas yelled, quickly standing up. "Ouch!" he squeaked, grabbing his backside, which he'd bruised a little as he landed at the bottom of his slide. "Where am I?" he asked himself, and then he started to cry. He began to feel helpless and afraid, not knowing what to do. These feelings were soon replaced by anger. He started to feel annoyed at himself. Why had he wanted so badly not to be found by Julie? Why did he have this urge to keep sneaking further and further away from his original hiding spot behind the big rock? He had no idea. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was nothing he could do about it now. He needed to find a way back to the others. So he started scanning the slope to see if there was a way to climb back up. He tried to make his way up, but he kept failing. Sometimes he'd grab onto a root poking out from the slope's wall, but then he wouldn't know how to keep going and would always slide back down to the ground. The slope was too steep and so high that even an adult would have trouble climbing it, let alone little Thomas. "Help! I'm over here!" he shouted several times, hoping someone would hear him. But all around him was a huge silence. Every now and then he spotted a fly or a bumblebee that had wandered into the small ravine while searching for flowers, which grew plentifully up above among the trees. "If only I had wings, I'd just fly up, and that'd be that," he muttered quietly. And at that moment, he noticed a little rabbit who suddenly appeared from one side of the ravine. The moment the rabbit saw Thomas, it quickly turned and hid behind the nearest large stone, of which there were plenty scattered across the ground. "Wait, little bunny," he said out loud and started slowly moving toward the rabbit without hesitation. "Are you lost too? Don't worry, I won't hurt you." But the rabbit just darted out from behind its rocky hideout and hid behind another. Thomas kept following, speaking gently to the rabbit, reassuring it that he meant no harm. The walls of the ravine began to narrow, curving slightly to the left and then to the right, until finally, Thomas reached the end of the ravine, where the two opposing walls met, and not even the rabbit could go further. "Well, I guess we're trapped," the boy said, a surprised look on his face, taking another step forward. At that moment, the frightened rabbit dashed along one of the ravine walls as fast as it could, zooming right past Thomas, who only managed to turn in time to watch it go. But the rabbit had already disappeared around the bend to the left, leaving Thomas standing there at the end of the ravine, mouth agape. It didn't take long for the boy to snap out of it, and he took off running in the same direction as the small animal. In just a few moments, he passed the spot where he'd slid down into the ravine. The walls of the ravine widened, curved to the left, and then he suddenly came to a sharp stop. A look of fear crossed his face. Little Thomas stood at the entrance of a cave. From where he was standing, it looked pitch dark inside, and like most young children, he didn't like the dark at all. At home, he even liked to fall asleep with a small candle burning on the little nightstand by his bed. Every evening, his mom would light it for him, and once he was asleep, she'd blow it out. "Bunny, where are you?" the boy called out, though deep down, he knew that the little animal must have disappeared somewhere inside the cave. Feeling sad, Thomas stepped slowly into the dark cave, sat down on a rock, and lowered his head in sorrow. "I want to go home," he whispered with a tear in his eye after a moment of silence. Then he carefully turned his head to look deeper into the cave and was surprised to find that it wasn't so dark after all. His eyes had adjusted, and he could see better in the dimness. As he looked around, he noticed that the cave seemed to bend slightly to the left, and there was a faint light at the far end. "So that's where you ran off to, Bunny," Thomas said with a smile, realizing that the cave was more like a tunnel, one that could lead him out of the ravine. He began to walk slowly through the dim cave, where there was still just enough light, watching his step to avoid tripping over the rocks scattered around. He finally ran outside and saw an open landscape with a small stream nearby, and beyond it, another forest stretching up a gentle hill. The bunny was the last thing on his mind now, because he remembered that the stream flowed past his village. Filled with hope, he headed straight for it, hoping it would lead him home. When he reached the stream, he hesitated for a moment, unsure which direction to take. But then he remembered the time he and Adrian had sailed little boats made of old tree bark, twigs, and leaves. They had played not far from the village and the old oak, and the boats had floated toward the village. "So, I need to follow the current," he whispered to himself and started walking. The path along the stream was full of obstacles, trees, bushes, and scattered boulders of all sizes, forcing him to weave around them. But Thomas didn't mind, because he was already imagining himself at home. He longed to be with his mom and dad again. He followed the stream for quite a while and noticed the shadows of the trees growing longer. The sun was preparing to finish its journey across the sky, and the day was slowly coming to an end. Just as he looked up to check how much time he had left before sunset, he thought he heard something. "Thomas! Tommy! Thomas!" came faint calls from all directions. The boy knew everyone in the village was searching for him by now, so he broke into a run and shouted back at the top of his lungs. "I'm here! Here!" He kept calling, and the voices seemed to grow louder. He ran and ran until, through the branches of a sprawling willow, he spotted rooftops. The sight brought a wide smile to his face, and he changed course, heading straight for the village. In a moment, he burst out of the tall grass that grew thickly around him, and before him stretched a small field with the whole village beyond, and just to the right, he could see the wide, ancient oak. "Here I am! Hello!" he shouted again, as he saw people, adults and children alike, hurrying around and calling his name. When they spotted him, they ran toward him, while some dashed toward the forest to summon others who had gone further afield in their search. "You little rascal, you really gave us a scare," exclaimed the blacksmith with his red beard. "Where have you been wandering, cried the seamstress, running right alongside him. Thomas was thrilled to be back among familiar faces and began asking after his mom and dad. It didn't take long before everyone gathered around him, including the children he'd been playing hide and seek with. The moment he saw his mother, He wrapped his arms around her tightly and promised he'd never go that far into the forest again. Then he told everyone what had happened, assuring them it wasn't on purpose. The villagers sighed with relief, and one by one they began returning to the village and their homes. In the end, only Thomas's parents and the children remained. Julie looked at him with a playful seriousness, hands on her hips and a smile on her face. "Well, looks like you finally won at hide and seek."